Greetings from the Hunter Museum of American Art in Chattanooga. This expertly crafted pop-up book from the Hunter Permanent Collection is designed by artist Kara Walker. It details the journey of an ex-slave to her home country, with all its nuances and complications. This work is a smaller example of the silhouette scenes for which she is known. You can see the book in our special exhibition, The F Word, We Mean Female. The exhibition tells the stories of many female artists, each artwork a different chapter. Hope you can visit soon.
Hello and welcome to the Southern Festival of Books, in conversation with Wanda Lloyd and David Pilgrim. I'm your host, Jared Porter, and I'm glad you've joined us today. Before we begin, on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, a thank you to our key sponsors of the Southern Festival of Books, the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Thank you for your support that makes this event possible. And speaking of support, the festival is free. It's a nonprofit event, and donations from individuals like you help make it possible every year. If you believe in this event and sessions like this one, you can help it happen. Please give at humtn.org. Again, that's humtn.org. A couple of reminders before we begin. Parnassus Books is the official bookseller for the festival, and purchasing books through Parnassus helps keep the festival free. You can buy books today through the links at the top of the chat. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions later in the session. If you're tuning in via Facebook Live or YouTube, you can submit questions by downloading the festival app or through the streaming site at www.humtn.org/SFB. Again, humtn.org/SFB. We ask that questions and comments made in the live chat area be civil and respectful. The festival staff will be monitoring and will remove comments if needed. I'm sure that won't be needed. And now I'd like to introduce our special guests. Wanda Lloyd is the author of Coming Full Circle: From Jim Crow to Journalism, the story of an African-American woman who grew up in the South of the 1950s and 60s. She went on to hold some of the highest-ranking newspaper leadership positions in America and was one of the first African-American women to be top editor of a mainstream daily newspaper. Coming Full Circle is a window at the intersection of race, gender, culture, and the media's role in American democracy. She's currently working on an anthology with her co-editor, novelist Tina McElroy-Ansah, called Meeting at the Table: African-American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community. She's also a member of the Georgia Writers Association Board of Directors. David Pilgrim is a professor, orator, and human rights activist, one of the nation's leading experts on multiculturalism, diversity, and race relations. He is the founder and curator of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia at Ferris University in Big Rapids, Michigan, a 13,000-piece collection that teaches about race, race relations, and racism through artifacts. At Ferris University, he's a professor of sociology and head of diversity and inclusion. He's the co-author of Haste to Rise, a remarkable experience of Black education during Jim Crow, which he's here to talk about today. I'm looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say, as I know you are. We'll start with Wanda. Welcome, Wanda Lloyd.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here at the Southern Festival of Books. I'm really honored to be included in this event. My memoir is a story of a young girl who grew up in the restrictive South in the 1950s and 60s and became a top daily newspaper editor. My dream was always to be a journalist. I went to school in a time when we were told where we could go to school, how we could go to school, the kind of equipment that we had, the kind of resources that we had. We had secondhand books, hand-me-down furniture, carted over from white schools. Our teachers were all Black. Everything was in my life all the way through high school was completely Black. And that was not necessarily a bad thing. It was a good thing, and that we had a sense of community, and we supported each other. Grew up in a Black neighborhood in a time when some of the people there were college educated and some of them barely finished high school. But we didn't discriminate among ourselves in terms of class. We all lived together, worked together, supported each other. I tell stories in my memoir about the neighbor ladies who were part of my village, who would sit on my grandmother's porch drinking lemonade out of mason jars, or would send me to the store sometimes to get a BC and a Coca-Cola with a few coins. I didn't know that they were getting high on the front porch. I just thought they had a headache all the time, because if anyone knows about those two things, those can be, they can make you a little bit loopy or intoxicated. But it was just fun to grow up in that kind of environment. We had segregated libraries. Our library we had a Black library that we would go to on the weekend, and following the direction of our teachers, we would take a couple of buses to get to the library, the Carnegie Library, which was a Black library, and then we would have to order the books from the library that our teachers needed, because sometimes the books that we wanted were not in the Black library. They were in the big white library downtown, and they had to take a week to get the books and then get them back to us. So we had to take the bus back home, and then the following weekend we would go back to the library and pick up the books that we wanted. We had segregated parks. We could not go in the parks in Savannah that other people went to. So I say all that to say it was a segregated upbringing. But then I transitioned after college at Spelman College. I transitioned into this mainstream world of daily newspapers. I decided in the 11th grade that journalism would be what I wanted to do after I was editor of my paper in high school. And so I went to, I found myself in a situation as a copy editor in my first newsroom, first of 7 daily newspaper newsrooms, where I was scared to death because I had never really spent time with white people. I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't understand the kinds of cultural things they were talking about. We had read different books. We had seen different movies. We had our growing up years were very different. And being in Providence, Rhode Island, which was my first newspaper, I mean, that was a culture shock all in itself, because I was no longer in the South. My book really is in 4 parts. I like to say there are 4 themes in my book. One is history, of course, and that is the Jim Crow part, and my family. That's my history and the history of our country at the time. And the second part, I would say, is the journalism, because I became a journalist. And so there are lots of stories in there about being a journalist, becoming an editor, becoming a senior editor at USA Today. And I'm going to read a little bit about that, about my time, a story from my time at USA Today. Another part is leadership, because I became a leader in daily newspapers, and the book is really about how I became a leader and the mentoring that I finally had when I was at USA Today, because we didn't have mentors growing up. I didn't know anybody who worked for a daily newspaper. My journalism teacher in high school didn't know anyone who worked at a daily newspaper. She taught us journalism from a book. And so here I was learning to be a leader in an industry that very few African Americans had become leaders in. And then the fourth part really is about diversity, because I became a diversity advocate in journalism, realizing that in the 70s, when I entered my first newsroom in 1970 as an intern, and then I went back to Providence for 2 years, I was the only one. I was the only one who looked like me in that newsroom. One of 2 women in the newsroom at the time. And so there was great work to be done to help newspapers understand the value of diversity, to do a lot of training in newsrooms. And so I became a diversity advocate through my company, the Gannett Company, from which I retired, but also through the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where I became a director. I want to read a story for you. It's a short story. At a time when I was senior editor at USA Today, and I had the responsibility of not only running the newsroom from the business side, running a newsroom with 400 and some people in the newsroom, 5 budgets totaling $40 million. So this was a big deal. But I was also responsible for the daily planning of the newspaper. And as part of that responsibility, I ran 2 of the 3 daily news meetings where we talked about what was going to go on page 1 tomorrow and usually the following day. And so here I was getting ready for a meeting to run one of these meetings at USA Today. And this is the beginning of a story. And we were in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington. I didn't recognize the caller ID, a number from the local 703 Virginia area code. When the desk phone rang, I had already risen from my office chair, standing there in my proper business suit and high-heeled pumps, supporting dancing feet that were ready to race down the hall to the conference room to sit at the head of the table and lead one of the daily USA Today news meetings. I was always keen about getting into the room before the meeting time, aware that my leadership encouraged others to take a seat at the meeting so that the meeting would begin on time. The director at my daughter's summer camp was calling me. Mrs. Lloyd, I need to share something that happened with Shelby today. Sorry, I lost my place. My heart raced, fearful that my 5-year-old daughter had fallen and cracked open her skull on the Alexandria campus, or she had run off from the grounds and the police were looking for her, or worse, she had drowned in the pool. Although the last fear was probably not the case, because when she was 2 years old, I had made sure to enroll Shelby in swimming lessons through her daycare program. By the time we called all the kids out of the pool today, Shelby had dropped her towel in the water, the director told me. The children take a rest and quiet down on their towels after pool time. Shelby asked one of the other little girls if she could share her dry towel. The little girl told Shelby no, because she said, my granddaddy said I can't let Black people touch me because the black might wear off. My mind, now far away from the urgency of the news meeting going on down the hall without me, struggled to process what I had just heard. The black might wear off, I repeated into the phone, not just to say it to the camp director, but to myself. Stunned, I walked around my desk and closed the office door. Someone else would have to lead the meeting. My tears were starting to fall. I was angry that I had lived through Jim Crow years when we were told when, where, and how we could exist, had survived the humiliation of being called nigger, of being spat at, of living a dual life of the best Black this and the best Black that, not just the best at something. I had grown up in the South where we were never surprised in the 1950s and 1960s to hear some dumb stuff about what white people thought about us or said out loud to us, or denied us the right to the best education or careers or neighborhood amenities. Here I was more than 20 years after leaving the Jim Crow South, and some white grandfather had instilled in one of his own that my child was a danger to his child because mine was Black. I was not mad at that child. It wasn't her fault. And I was not mad at the director because she told me the child, the daughter of a camp employee, was immediately sent home for the day after she was confronted with the reason why my Shelby was left standing, crying by the pool because this little girl had denied sharing a towel. Shelby was not old enough to understand the racist statement, the black might wear off. Shelby was likely just not happy that someone she probably considered to be a friend had denied her the opportunity to share her towel, her space. Although Shelby's lesson clearly was to be more careful with her own towel from then on. But as my fingers swept across my tears, I recognized that I had to go home that night and explain to my daughter, as best I could explain it, the lesson this little white girl had learned from her grandfather, someone who was probably still steeped in the racist behavior of his own ancestors. I had not imagined that I would still be dealing with this kind of racist behavior directed toward my own child. Now I fear that Shelby may someday have to deal with racism with her own children and her children's children. The thought angers me to this day. So I try to tell a lot of the stories in a relatable way instead of just preaching this was bad, this is what happened to Jim Crow. But I recognized as I was growing through my life and my career that there was still a lot of leftovers, habits from Jim Crow all around me. And that by leaving the South, I did not leave Jim Crow behind because, as you know, we're all over the country and people have moved here and there. And so it really was still going on, which of course we see still going on today. I'm hopeful that my memoir will inspire young people who are um, aspiring to be not just journalists, but also in other careers, and also leaders, because it's very important for young African Americans and women to understand how important it is to have opportunities for leadership wherever they are. And we learn leadership in so many different ways. I talk in the book about the leadership lessons I got in my neighborhood, in my church, in my school, in my college, where I was editor of my paper in college as well. There are lots of opportunities for leadership. And clearly, seeking those opportunities when we get into our careers is very important. The biggest lesson that I want to leave young people with is that when you become a leader, please pull up a chair and bring someone else along. Don't just keep it to yourself, but show other people how to become leaders. And I'm very proud through mentoring that I've been able to do that. And my book really outlines all of those things as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Wanda. Powerful memories, changing times. Some ways times have changed, some ways they haven't. And I know that your story will continue and that there are more chapters to be written. David, I wanted to bring you into the chat and the conversation here, and look forward to hearing your remarks about Jim Crow and all of the works.
Well, thank you so much. And I was talking to Wanda before we went on the air, and I said to her that I sometimes feel like we went to sleep in 2020, but we awakened in 1957. Much of the rhetoric that I hear nationally sounds a lot like what it sounded like when I was growing up in Alabama in the 1960s. That's unfortunate, but it's like sometimes young people come into the Jim Crow Museum and they'll say to me, like, what was it like to live during the Jim Crow, during the struggle, during the civil rights struggle? And what I say to them is, we're still living during the civil rights struggle, despite many changes that have occurred in this country. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I will actually start with a reading, and hopefully it comes through. So I'll go ahead and get started. A mural troubles me. It is not a mural in the narrow sense, a painting on a wall. Rather, it is a free hanging oil painting on a stretched canvas. The mural is a massive triptych displayed in the atrium of the Arts and Sciences building at Ferris State University. The three panels are presented in an inverted T shape. The left panel, Movers and Shakers, portrays President Bill Cederberg and his administrative team as they plan the university's future. The right panel, Activities, is a collection of fictional student athletes. The center panel is called The Visionary. The dominant figure is Woodbridge Nathan Ferris, the university's founder. He is larger than the other figures and appears to be looking over them as they continued the work that he began in 1884. The mural is a visual success. This is not surprising. Robert Burnham, the mural's creator, is an award-winning artist. His skill as an artist and his familiarity with the institution, he had been employed as a professor for 7 years, made him a likely candidate for painting the mural. Burnham envisioned a historical, allegorical painting of Ferris State University, and he used his paintbrushes to tell the story that he knew. The story that Burnham knew, indeed the story that most of us knew, had little to say about the African-American presence at Ferris State University. Although there are a couple of racially ambiguous characters in the painting, there is only one figure who clearly represents an African-American. a black man holding a sign that says, "Negotiate now." Viewers of the mural might reasonably infer that African Americans were of little consequence in the history of the university. For 17 years, I taught sociology at Ferris State University. For much of that time, I had an office in the Arts and Sciences building, so I saw that mural hundreds of times. My critique of the painting is softened by the realization that even though I am an African American, one who frequently taught courses about race relations, I too knew little about the history of African Americans at Ferris. I had heard stories about racial fights in the 1960s and student protests in the 1980s, and I had a vague knowledge of Gideon Smith, reputed to have been the first African American student at Ferris. That was all I knew. It pains me to say this, but the mural bothered me because I believed it was true, a historically accurate interpretation of the past. Now I know better. And so the way it happened was, I'm the VP for Diversity and Inclusion at Ferris State, and our campus, the art on our campus is profoundly white. And I said to Franklin Hughes, my co-author of the book, go and find a photograph of Gideon Smith, because we thought he was the first African American at the school. And we're going to build a sculpture or some huge painting. And he went and he found a painting, a picture, but it had several African Americans in it. And I said to him, "Who are these other people?" And he said he didn't know. And I was like, "Okay, well, we need to find out." And he should get credit for this story, or at least for the creation of this story, because he began to dig in old newspapers and in old university catalogs. And what we discovered was between 1910 and the 1920s, over 60 African Americans came from Hampton Institute north to Ferris State University to take college and college prep classes. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this, they were some of the most influential people in the American Civil Rights Movement and in the history of this country. For example, the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court was Belford Lawson. You have to understand how much pride I had when I discovered that he was one of the students who attended Ferris, what was then called Ferris Institute. Percival Prattis, who was the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, and the first African American in 1947 became the first African American to be admitted to the press corps of the Houses of Congress, attended Ferris. He was one of the students who came from Hampton to Ferris. But we discovered many of them, and they lived amazing lives, and no one had told this story before. And so it kind of reminds me, sometimes people say, why do we have Black history and Mexican history and women's history and all these other histories? And my answer to that is, if you don't want all these other histories, just do it right and write history in a way that's inclusive, mature, and accurate. And so that's the story that's told in the book Haste to Rise. But it's also the story of our founder, because long before it was normative, our founder was an anti-racism advocate. He, as I said before, brought those students there. He also brought Booker T. Washington to our campus to address our students. He would read from the writings of Booker T. Washington, from W.B. Du Bois and other African Americans. He was reading Du Bois's writings, for example, The Souls of Black Folks in 1903, when it first came out, and was very controversial. He also, by the way, if you think of John Brown, who is one of the most divisive characters in America's history, some people see him as a madman, a crazed fanatic. Others see him as an important historical figure who helped usher in the Civil War. Well, for a white college president in the early 1900s to be praising John Brown as a hero was uncommon. But he did, as I said, when The Birth of a Nation came out, he condemned it. He used his position as governor to help African Americans. So this book was also an opportunity to celebrate our founder. And so, you know, it's kind of interesting because I was talking to Franklin and I said, this was a labor of love, but it was most definitely labor. You know, I've always been a little jealous of my colleagues who are writers who, you know, they can set aside an hour a day for a glass of sherry and a paragraph. I'm not that guy, you know. I just write until it's done. So anyway, I'm proud of the work. If Franklin were here with me today, he would share that pride. So anyway, that's that piece. I did want to mention a little bit about the museum. The Jim Crow Museum is located at Fair State University. We are the nation's largest publicly accessible facility using objects of intolerance to promote social justice. And the museum has been in its current location since 2002, but since 2012, but we've received so many thousands of objects, and some of them are worth quite a bit of money. People come from all over the country there because they know we're going to have deep and meaningful discussions about race. So we're now in the early stages of building a new museum. I think you guys probably have a picture of that, but it is an amazing concept. Look at that. Are you freaking kidding me? That is amazing. We're going to bring people from all over the world to this place and continue to do the thing that many Americans don't want to do, but all of us know deep down we ought to be doing, which is to have engaged conversations about race relations and racism. So thank you so much for having me on here, and I will defer the rest of my time to the question and answer section.
Thank you so much. I look forward to visiting myself one day. I can't wait for the doors to open of what you've just shown us. And in the meantime, it's an incredible look at our history, our past, some of the uncomfortable portions of it. And that actually brings me to a question that I'd like to throw out. You know, we talked about some of the disturbing things from our past that are cycling back around today. Some have never gone away, of course. There are disturbing things. There are a lot of concerns out there, but looking at it in a different way, do you see, are there things that are hopeful, I think, that are repeating themselves? You know, there were things that, you know, created a lot of hope and movement and way forward back then with everything that was going on. Do you see that happening again today amid the concerning aspects that are arising again?
Well, if I can start, I will say that I'm hopeful after the unfortunate death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and but I'm hopeful that because so many people took to the streets and expressed themselves through protesting, I'm discouraged by some of the things that went on during the protests and some of the conversations that went on during the protests that kind of distracted us from that. But yet again, I'm hopeful because I see so many young people. And I see so many people who are not African American who are out there protesting in the midst of COVID, taking that chance, trying to be as safe as possible. Many of them, hopefully most of them were very safe. I see, and then it expanded, exploded really throughout the world. So I'm really hopeful about that. I see some of it is still going on. I hope that it will remain as peaceful as possible because I don't think we'll get anywhere with violence. I can only be hopeful. I think I'm holding my breath until after the election just to see, because I think that Congress has, some action has to take place. We saw that in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all those things. So Congress has to get involved, and I know that's not going to happen until maybe next year. So I hope I'm holding in reserve my hope for that. I'm also hopeful. You mentioned that my friend Tina Makara and I are working on a book. And that gives me hope as well, because you talked, David, about the conversations about race. And so we are starting a conversation with this book, Meeting at the Table, African American Women Write on Race, Culture, and Community. And I'm hoping that so many other communities will start having those conversations. African American women, in our case, I saw a really cute video on Facebook yesterday with women. I can't remember who the women were, if they were all of one career. I think they were all HBCU graduates. And then they said, okay, men, it's your turn now. And then the men had this little commercial that, that they did, just talking about hope and how proud they are to be Black. But I think those conversations have to go on in many, many, many creative ways. And I've been one of the proponents of conversations about race for a very long time. I think now we're starting to see that happen. Yeah,
I would second that. I mean, that's the work that we do in the museum. So the fact is this country has had social justice movements or iterations of it for many, many, many decades. This current social justice movement, set off by the brutal killing of George Floyd and others, I think has certainly caused not just corporations and police departments, but every part of our society to think seriously about the role of race and racism in the larger society, but also in ourselves. And so it's a shame that it often, that good conversation often follows atrocities. It shouldn't take the killing of a Black man or a woman to do that. Unfortunately, it often does. So the answer to your question about whether or not I'm hopeful, I actually am hopeful. I mean, I was when Aunt Jemima, the branding changed, and so we got phone calls, of course, because we've been pushing for that for decades. And so some people would say, yeah, but that's just symbolism. It doesn't really do anything. That's not true. Symbols matter, and it's part of a larger effort, which includes also helping this country deal with systematic instances of racism and injustice. Again, if it gets this nation to do the thing that many of its citizens are most reluctant to do, which is to have engaged and productive conversations, then yes, that's good. And in that sense, I'm hopeful.
Thank you both. And just wanted to remind our viewers, you do have an opportunity to submit questions. You can do that through the festival app and also at the live streaming site at humtn.org/SFB. Please do submit your questions. We have about 10 minutes left and would love to know what's on your mind. Wanted to pitch another question back over to David. Your work with the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, you're literally coming face to face with some very disturbing things, I'm sure, some very troubling things, some very bad memories of the past. What would you say is the museum's purpose, and what would you hope that as you come face to face with those artifacts, with those visuals, what do you hope that people come away with as a result of visiting?
Yeah, well, I think our name is misleading, because when it says Jim Crow Museum, people assume we only have objects from the past. It is true that most of the objects in the museum were objects created between the 1870s and the 1960s, but we also have sections on brand new objects that are created. Henry Louis Gates, one of my friends and friends of the museum, he travels around the country telling people that the Jim Crow Museum has a wing dedicated to objects that defame and belittle President Obama. Well, it's not a wing, but we certainly have lots of objects that quite frankly mock President Obama, and often in ways that you would have associated with the past. So to answer your question, I had an epiphany recently in the museum. Yeah, we have some civil rights pieces there. Yeah, we have some objects that show African-American achievement, African-Americans pushing back against these objects. But most of the museum are these ugly things you referenced. And my epiphany was this, that this museum is really a museum to the resiliency of African-American people. because when you see in one space all of these, thousands of everyday objects, any object you can think of, we have a racist version of it. And you think of a society where racism was so embedded in the everyday objects and the everyday lives of people. And yet, despite that, African Americans accomplished great things in this society. So in that sense, it's really, and again, it hit me like an epiphany. This is about resiliency. This is about not allowing others to stop you.
Thank you, David. And I'll pose the next question to Wanda. In the same vein, we just talked about not letting circumstances stop you. Wanda, did you have experiences in your past where you really had to, I feel silly for asking it, but did you had to fight to get to where you got? I mean, you occupied some of the highest newspaper leadership positions in the country several times over. What did it take for you to get there?
Well, I wouldn't exactly call it a fight, but I would call it a struggle. At the Washington Post, where I was for 11 years, I repeatedly tried to get promoted to different roles because I saw, quite frankly, white people who were less qualified than me doing some of the things that I thought I could do. I never had designs on being the managing editor or the top editor at the Washington Post. My last name was not Graham, the family that owns the newspaper, and I don't look like them. And I just knew that wasn't going to happen because, quite frankly, our leadership in the newsroom at the time, who was the brilliant editor, Ben Bradley, diversity was not at the top of his agenda. He had he was a very good editor, but diversity was not there. So, but I did apply for several roles, and it just, when you hear, every time you apply for something, you hear code words like you're not smart enough, you don't have the personality, you don't have the background, it's just so many, you don't have the depth of knowledge, those kinds of code words that basically say you're Black and you're not the person we want in this role. And so at some point I had to think about, well, is this the place for me? When I went to the Post, it was such a great newspaper, still is, and I thought this is the place I'm going to retire from. But at some point I had to realize that wasn't going to happen. So fighting for me, struggling for me was probably the most at the Washington Post. But then I became a senior editor at USA Today and managing editor at a paper in Greenville, South Carolina, and executive editor in Montgomery. So I guess my struggles in those places was to change coverage, to change the way we look at coverage of African Americans. And one of the struggles that I talk about in the book is explaining to the editors at these newspapers that it's a stereotypical thing to continue to run the mugshots of young African American males who were arrested for crimes day after day after day after day. That you pick up the paper and every day you see mugshots, you see them in the orange uniform or the stripe or whatever the uniform was at the county jail or the city jail. And it took having a conversation with chiefs of police in 2 communities where I was editor to talk about what that means in the community. What do they hear from people who see this in the newspaper day after day on page 1? And I brought those police chiefs into the newsroom to talk to the editors, to kind of have that conversation about race. And then I established a rule that we would no longer run the pictures of any criminal suspects who on page 1. We just would stop that, whether they were Black, white, male, female, whoever they were. Because quite frankly, the police chief said, yeah, most of there's a disproportionate number of young Black men who are arrested. And there are lots of reasons for that, lots of systematic racist reasons for that. During the drug years and the drug wars, during the time when we had lots of guns on the street, and we still do. But they didn't need to have their pictures out there because they were just suspects at the time. My only exception was if someone was at large and a threat to society, if they were violent and they weren't yet arrested, that was the exception. So that was one of the biggest struggles that I had. And it worked. It took a little while getting used to. I had a little pushback from some folks who continued to say, well, we've always done it that way and that's why we do it. But eventually people got past that.
We have a comment from a viewer that I wanted to bring out. A viewer says, "Thank you to both authors for comments on perseverance in relation to hope." Again, we talked before about there are very troubling and concerning things that happen in the course of history and in the course of the here and now. And I think it's important to also to remember the things that the silver linings, the things that give us hope. And I think that you've both certainly done that.
Yeah, and I want to comment on something that David brought up. He talked about how things are changing in the corporate world, and that now really all of a sudden corporations are making changes. They're hiring these vice presidents for diversity and inclusion and equity and all those things. And I remember tweeting right after I started seeing a succession of these hires that I hope these folks, I'm glad to see this, but I hope these folks have some power. I hope they're reporting to the CEO so that they have, they come with the agency of making change in their organizations. I will also say that even in the newspaper business, or I should say in the media business, because it's gone beyond newspapers now, I'm starting to hear from different corporations who've asked me to come and speak virtually to some of their staff about the importance of diversity and give them literally tools for how they can achieve more diversity. Some of the things that we did back in the 80s and 90s, and we were on track for diversity, that got shut down in 2008 because of the recession. And it never really picked up again until 2020, in the time when, we just talked about after the death of George Floyd. And so now people really are, I think, getting serious about it. That, again, speaks to that hope. And so a lot of organizations are getting a little more serious. I hope it continues. David, I have not taken the Aunt Jemima syrup out of my pantry yet, but when the bottle is empty, I'm glad to say that I won't have to buy another bottle of Aunt Jemima syrup. So I do see hope there as well in these corporations as they make these changes at the top.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I wanted to just thank Wanda Lloyd, author of Coming Full Circle, From Jim Crow to Journalism, and David Pilgrim, co-author of Haste, A Remarkable Experience of Black Education During Jim Crow. And I just have some closing remarks here. I just hope that everyone has enjoyed this session as much as I have. Such an important conversation. Wanda and David have given us a lot to think about, certainly, and I thank them for the work they've done and continue to do. It matters such a great deal. Another comment, wonderful, insightful conversations. So it's just an honor, I think, for all of us to be part of this. Before we close, I'd like to remind our viewers that donations from festival goers help make the Southern Festival of Books possible every year and free. If you believe in the festival and sessions like this one, please give at humtn.org. That's humtn.org. You can donate securely online. As soon as the session concludes, I'm going to donate, and I hope you will too. Lastly, if you'd like to purchase books from this session, you can do so through the links posted in the chat area or through the Parnassus website at http://parnassusbooks.net/SFB. Again, that's parnassusbooks.net/SFB. I think we've all got a lot of good reading to enjoy, so I hope you'll check those out, and remember that does support the festival. Thank you so much, Wanda. Thank you, David, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.